So I hope you'll forgive me for saying that I was given this task quite short notice. And so you'll have to forgive, I'm reading from a script. The thinking behind it is a little rambling, but I've really cherished the opportunity to start exploring this. And it's certainly something that I now want to make part of my year, really, is looking deeper into the topics that I'm beginning to explore in this talk with you. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. So my hope is that you'll find, a few things of interest to pick out. If you find a through line in the talk, then God is with you. But even if it's just the odd phrase here and there, or a quotation or something like that, carry that with you, and mull it over. And as that wonderful phrase in the Bible is, ponder it in your heart. I always think that's a good way of thinking about responding to these talks. The other thing to say is that this isn't necessarily my area of expertise. And so when I was thinking about, what route shall I go down? Or, what can I draw upon in my own experience and thinking that can be any kind of authority on this matter? And so the route that really appealed to me was one of looking at theology and the relationship between ecology and theology, rather than necessarily presenting you with, go forth and join Extinction Rebellion, for example. So I'm going to take that sort of approach to this talk, and I hope that actually sort of leads into talk about how that can manifest itself actively in the world, in your small groups perhaps afterwards. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Laudato Si. Has anyone read Laudato Si? Great. So you'll be aware that this is the encyclical, a letter sent out by Pope Francis in 2014. And it's often referred to as the environmental encyclical. But in fact, it's interesting, and this will come up later, that Pope Francis himself wants to refer to it as a social encyclical, because the relationship between the two, the environment and social concerns, is completely interrelated. And that's what the encyclical sort of seeks to say, really, is that we can't think about one without the other. And so this letter is addressed to not just all Catholics, not just all Christians, but the entire world, and has actually been taken up by quite a lot of sort of lot of political discussions since it was published. So it's also called On Care for Our Common Home, and the common home is another way of thinking about how we understand the environment. And one of the most important things that you need to know about Laudato Si, I think, is that it calls for a conversion. That's a conversion of the heart, of the mind, of the body. And insistently and consistently, Pope Francis uses words and phrases that point loud and clear to a need to redirect our living. But before we go into this, I think it's important to give you a little bit more to think about in relation, how ecology relates to theology. So why does the Pope, feel a need or responsibility to write on topics of ecology? There have been many people who've wanted to dismiss the interference of theology in environmentalism. Climate change is a political, not a religious matter, they might say. It calls for immediate and urgent action, not abstract questioning. Well, this talk aims to illustrate the essential relationship between those two. Practical action is needed on an individual and also a political scale, and the situation is indeed desperate. But practical action implies a goal, and a goal implies a vision of the world. And that vision demands that we think deeply, carefully, and with humility about our relationship to creation and how we narrate that in our own lives. Pope Francis, in his most recent encyclical, Rejoice and Be Glad, which is the one that Adam mentioned on Friday, for anyone who was here then, he says this line, which I'll repeat throughout, and hopefully you'll hear it being echoed. We are called to be contemplatives, even in the midst of action. So while there feels this urgency to do something about the climate and crisis, we are called to be contemplatives, even in the midst of that action. So, looking a little bit deeper into why is theology relevant for ecological thinking. By the way, I should just say, as a side note, that I am often told by my students that I talk too quickly. So if you think, oh my gosh, she's going 500 miles an hour, do just, say, hey, flag me down. Apart from Iggy, because I'll just ignore Iggy. So I heard a very good talk on environmental ethics and theology in Cambridge last autumn, given by an up-and-coming scholar called Simone Kotva, and I would suggest you look out for her. She's a really interesting woman. And she was challenged at the end of her talk by a very astute student who said, and I quote, "The implicit promise on a talk on ecology is that it will bear some kind of relation to possible practical action. The implicit promise in a talk on ecology is that it will bear some kind of relation to possible practical action." And he felt that her talk had lacked something in regard to this promise. It hadn't given possible practical action to be followed from it. And, I've certainly felt writing this that you may feel that there's an implicit promise that you're going to go away, especially as I'm doing this under the pillar of impact, that you're going to go away with some possible practical action. But Simone Kotva had a really interesting response to that, and I think it's an important one. And it was that we want to be moved to action, but she observed certain dangers in the desire for maxims and for practical action, without thoroughly critiquing our understanding of creation and our place within it. Studies in ecology, she went on, tend to offer a systematized account of the world, as if it were easily surveyable. It presents a world in which, if we acted upon certain principles, the crisis would be solved. But if we accept, as theology always has done, that our view of this world and our place in it is really limited, then this idea of the restored or healed world that ecology is tending towards is really a fantasy. We settle for an idea of harmony and an idea of reality that is in fact an idol. And I thought that was a really, really fascinating answer, because what she's sort of saying here is it's not just about the urgency of action, but it's about, and this is what I'll go back to with Laudato Si, it's about this complete conversion of our understanding of our relationship with nature and our place within nature. And if we don't see that, then what are we saving? We're working towards a chimera. We're working towards a situation where we still have the same understanding that has led us to this place in the first place. And this really convinced me that actually theology has a really strong place in understanding ecology. So she says, and in this context, what appears to be practical action is not really practical. It's making us feel better momentarily, but it's actually ineffectual if we don't carefully ask ourselves, what version of reality am I working towards? And this is a strain that comes through Laudato Si as well. One of the things that's really interesting in Laudato Si, and I encourage you all to go away and read it, if anything, if for nothing else, than to sort of clarify all the muddle that I've given you in this talk. Go away, read it. But hopefully I can give you a few focuses to look for when you read it. And one of them is, look at the way that Pope Francis talks about success and how we measure success and how we think of time in relation to success. And throughout the encyclical, he wants to question the ways that we measure success in our own environmental action without having a theological basis for it. So, that's just one route to go down if you want to go and read it. But this relationship between theology and ecology is nothing new at all. In fact, in 1967, there was a guy called Lynn White. Has anyone ever read Lynn White's essay? It's become quite well known in environmental ethics and an understanding of the history of where we are now in relation to environmental crisis. And Lynn White said, well, blame Christianity. Christianity is at the root of what's gone wrong. And he said this because it's Christianity that has conditioned our belief about a kind of anthropocentric world in which we can take what we like from the earth as long as it benefits us, because we are what are important in creation. Now, obviously, as a Christian, I'm not wholeheartedly given to agree with Lynn White. But I do think he makes some really, really powerful points, and one of them is that that we often have not thought carefully enough about what we mean by anthropocentric, and actually that's going to be a sort of guiding line throughout my talk. Is, well, how can we reinterpret this idea of a world that is at which we are the centre, which is what the Christian narrative is. Humanity is made in the image of God. It is this extraordinary peak of the mountain, given extraordinary dignity. And so, there is this anthropocentric narrative. I should just clarify, because I know I'm using anthropocentric, it might not be a word everyone's familiar with, meaning, yes, sorry, I just whipping it out there. But anyway, it's person-centered. So anthropos is Greek for human, and so anthropocentric, human-centered, where humanity is at the center of the universe, the center of what is important in the universe. So Lynn White says this, that, but he also says, human ecology is deeply conditioned by beliefs and about our nature and destiny, that is, by religion. So he's saying it's deeply influenced by religious beliefs, and actually it's religious beliefs that have often, changed whole ideologies, which have changed whole modes of action, which have changed whole ways that we relate to things, and particularly, he's saying, the whole way we relate to the earth. He says that, and he talks about the reckless plunder of the earth for our own benefit. And what I want to do in the first part of this talk is show you that actually he has some cause for, there's some truth in this, and we have to face up to it, because the place we're in terms of this crisis, as Greta Thunberg said last year at Davos, now is a time to panic. That's what she was saying. The house is on fire. Now is a time to panic. And there is a sense of urgency in this. And when there's a sense of urgency, you can't hide away. You have to look directly at what is facing you. And one thing that is facing us is a history of thinking, particularly within Catholicism, that has led to some brutalizing of our environment. And I think we need to face that in order to have this conversion at the heart of the church and at the heart of our belief. So I'm going to give you a few little examples later on about how the history of thinking over the last 150 years within Catholicism. But let me just continue down this road for a little bit longer. So I'll take you back to Kotva. So Simone Kotva, who I spoke about, who is I saw speak at Cambridge, who answered the upstart young student. Kotva observed a positive potential in this link between religious belief and our attitude towards the environment. A positive, whereas Lynn White is talking about a negative impact. She's talking about a positive impact. Theologians have persistently recognised the fact that we don't know who we are, what we have, that something about our relationship with the world involves an inherent blindness, and this blindness is deeply destructive. The first obvious place to look for this is, of course, Genesis and the idea of a fallen world. But we also find it in John's Gospel, and we hear the notion of not just individual sin, but the sin of the world. That sin is not only about what we do, but it is a situation that we are in. That something about the whole of creation has been infected by a sin that humanity brought to it. And that being in this situation mediates what we can and cannot know about the truth. And we are completely entangled in this situation of this inherent blindness. So what do we do? It seems hopeless, this idea that I'm presenting you with here. And particularly sin in the context of environmental crisis is not only about destructive action, but about understanding what the predicament is to begin with. So, as I said, we seem to be completely entangled in this, the sin of the world, in this situation where we have limits on our understanding of our place within it. We seem to destroy without, when we have good intentions. And it feels sometimes like we're flailing around, and it's very difficult to know how we can redeem this situation. And speaking of the sin of the world, I thought as I was writing this, brought to mind a pupil of mine. A pupil I might have spoken to some of you about this weekend. Anyway, he's quite a tricky pupil in many ways, but I teach him religious studies, and he has systematically dismissed every theological idea I put in front of him. And you know, no matter how much of my sort of theological education I bring to this, no, none of it. It's all nonsense. But that was until we got to the topic of redemption. And this was interesting. It really fascinated me. He said that this one idea made perfect sense to him. And I was confused, and I said, well, why is that? And he said, it was so plainly apparent that the environmental crisis was a monumental bull's-up out of which humanity could not effect its own redemption. There was a need for a redeemer. He could see that, and he could admit that. And so this was the one point in the Christian narrative in which he saw sense and a sort of shared understanding of our relationship with creation and with the world. And it's the narrative of a world that is irreversibly wounded, one that needs help from outside. And it's through this sin that we find ourselves completely entangled in creation in a way that we can't unpick for ourselves, but also that our sin has a bearing on all of creation. So I was going to include in this talk, but I didn't really have time to do it. But Maximus the Confessor, who is another person I would say go away and read, because he writes very interestingly about a relationship with creation. And he says that look at it's not only humans that die, creatures die too. And it was that triggered in him the thinking that, well, they not only, also creatures, look at the way creatures kill one another. Look at the violence of creation. Now it is something that has come out of us, and so we are, in some ways, responsible for whatever other violence we see in the world, even if it seems to us to be completely what we might call natural. He wants to almost deny this distinction between, there's natural stuff and then there's the human stuff. We are completely involved in it. So I'll give you a really quick summary of what I've got so far, because I know that you don't have any visual aids, although I'll put this up so that it can at least entertain those of you who get bored. So a quick summary is that a talk on ecology, I was saying practical action assumes a goal, you can't, or a purpose, right, as we've been talking about earlier in the weekend. A purpose suggests a vision of where you're getting to, a vision of our relationship with creation. Now, Christianity has a role to play in asking what is that vision, and what of our own narrative can we bring to bear on our understanding of what that will have to look like, our vision for a world that survives terrible destruction in a way that we're facing right now. And also, just coming back to that idea that the reason that it's worth looking at theology a little bit more closely and not just going, let's just get on with it, is that line from Pope Francis in his most recent encyclical, that we are called to be contemplatives even in the midst of action. So, Lynn White's accusation, I'll go back to this. I said I was going to give you a little bit of a history of, in the last 150 years, I'll try and be brief with it, because I don't want to give you a history lesson. But anyway, the last 150 years of the relationship that Catholicism has had with the environment. And I'm skipping out huge, I'm just going to give you 4 markers, basically. But Lynn White's accusation, I think, is one that's worth facing up to. This idea that Christianity is to blame for this, plundering of the earth. And it's a point on which we Christians often clash with other people who have environmental concerns, is that we insist that humanity is the turning point of all creation. And obviously within that, Christ. So we've all been recently celebrating, very recently, within the last hour, that God became man and dwelt among us. And so what will come through this is that Laudato Si presents an interesting approach to anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism, it's quite a difficult word to say, in Christian thought. And we'll come to see how it presents a different idea of anthropocentrism. I'll give you a little bit of context, so you know what it's coming out of, what this text is coming out of. So here's a very potted history. So, in 1860, right at the beginning of animal welfare movements in Europe, it was Pope Pius IX, I think. Yeah, Pope Pius IX was called upon to accept or refuse the building of an animal hospital in the Vatican, and he was given the task of, in any buildings that were built in the Vatican, it had to pass the Pope's approval, and he refused it, and he said it's not a concern that, with which we should busy ourselves. We should focus on human matters, and this is sort of the way in which he was thinking about the world is sort of, I think, well illustrated in a little quotation that comes from the Catholic Dictionary of 1897, which says this: "Animals have no rights. The brutes are made for man, who has the same right over them which he has over plants and stones. It is lawful to put them to death, or to inflict pain on them, for any good or reasonable end, even for the purpose of recreation." And I know this is about animal welfare, and you might be thinking that's not quite the same thing as environmentalism, but it does show, something that Lynn White is accusing Christians of, which is this idea that you can treat anything in the world in the way that you might treat a stone, in the way that a little child might treat a stone, lobbing it into the pond or whatever. It doesn't really matter. It's for your own, as long be reasonable, but even for recreational purposes, it's permissible. Now, neither of these things actually have any strong bearing on Catholic social teaching, for example, in the way that an encyclical would. They're just, I wanted to show you how Catholic thinking at the time shaped people's, what people wrote and did in relation to Catholic thinking around the environment. But in 1891, you get this encyclical that is seen as the seed of Catholic social teaching for the rest of the 20th century, and it's drawn upon very often in the encyclicals that come after, as being the first place where you get a really strong message of Catholic social teaching coming from an encyclical. And this is a Rerum Novarum, which is just worth reading for, even if you're more interested in politics, it's an interesting thing to read. But what Pope Leo III does in this encyclical is he connects the treatment of the environment with moral concerns. And now that is something that, in a slightly different way, but still the same idea, Peter Singer and Mary Robinson and various other environmental activists have been trying to do in the last 10 years, and convince people that that there's a link between moral concerns and the environment. And I mean, that might sound bizarre because we all think that's just a given, but it's this connecting the idea of justice with the idea of how we treat the environment that he was really, that he was doing that in 1891. And so this is the motivation behind it was the undignified treatment of people in the Industrial Revolution, and to try and better the relationship between employer-employee, and to understand, he understood land as being significant because, each person was, had a certain relationship with the land, and through that relationship, they built a bond with that land. And so there's this idea of private property that comes up with that encyclical, which, has a bearing on our understanding of the relationship between Catholic teaching and the environment, and I think shows a bit of a change in mentality and attitude. So I'll give you a little bit of a quote. I think I'll cut out most of it, actually. The main thing that he's saying here is that he's recognizing that the land that has been worked by the hand and the art of the tiller greatly changes. The wilderness is made fruitful, the barren field fertile. And he says that those who have laboured on a certain soil and borne this fruit, they have put something of themselves into that soil. And so they have a kind of covenant with it. They have a relationship with it. And so this is that change that I'm talking about in attitude. So let's skip ahead to the millennium in my little history lesson. But you can see that you're still getting this. It's still very much, the land is important because of how it impacts on justice and on the lives of people. So there's no sense that there's moral responsibility to the earth itself. It's just that the earth is a sort of backdrop for our salvation, and therefore, we need to take it into account when we're thinking about how we treat other people. So John Paul II, there's a shift in this attitude again, because he says, at a general audience in 2000, human beings must rediscover our fraternity with the earth, to which we have been linked since creation. And so that word fraternity evokes a very different approach. I have to say that none of these are innovations, but they draw upon different parts of the tradition. And this in particular might be familiar, fraternity, the idea of fraternity with creation might be familiar to anyone who knows this saint. Who knows this saint?
St. Francis.
Yeah, St. Francis, yeah, absolutely. I thought, I'd lighten this bit of the talk by just giving you a little bit of Bonaventure's account of St. Francis, and so you can hear the fraternity between what it looks like, the fraternity with the earth. So, as he was hastening by the lake of Rieti unto the hermitage of Greccio, a fisherman, out of devotion, brought unto him a waterfowl, the which he gladly received, and then, opening his hands, bade it depart. But the waterfowl would not leave him. Then, lifting his eyes to heaven, he remained for a long space in prayer, and after a long hour, returning to himself, as though from afar, he gently bade the little bird depart, and praised the Lord. Then, having received his blessing and leave, the bird flew away, showing joy by the movement of its body. In like manner, from the same lake there was brought unto him a fine live fish, which he called, and as was his wont, by the name of brother. So brother fish, he's referring to this fish. And he put it back in the water, next to the boat. The fish played in the water next to the man of God, and as though drawn by love of him, would in no wise leave the boatside until he had received his blessing and leave. On another time, when he was walking with a certain brother through the Venetian marshes, he chanced a great host of birds that were sitting and singing among the bushes. Seeing them, he said unto his companion, "Our sisters the birds are praising their Creator. Let us go too among them, and sing to the Lord praises, and the canonical hours." When they had gone into the midst, the birds stirred not from the spot, and when by reason of their twittering, the brothers could not hear each other in the reciting of the hours, St. Francis turned to the birds and said, "My sisters the birds, cease from singing, while we render our due praises unto the Lord." Then the birds held their peace, and remained silent, until, having said the hours at leisure, and rendered his praises, the holy man of God again gave them leave to sing. And as the man of God gave them leave, they once took upon their song again after their wonted fashion. So this is, an image of fraternity. And it's also, apart from just being joyful, I think it's not, St. Francis is the most well-known example of this, but there are many, many accounts of saints having this extraordinary interaction with the world, in which they somehow, something about holiness and sanctity evokes a certain response, or inspires a certain response from creation. And it's one of reconciliation and obedience and understanding. And I think this is what I understand John Paul II to mean when he uses the word fraternity, and to be why he's chosen this word. So he also says, the environment is God's gift to everyone, and in our use of it, we have a responsibility towards the poor, future generations, and humanity as a whole. and all of those things, the poor, future generations, humanity as a whole, you can see that it's coming back round to our moral obligation to humanity. And this is where Laudato Si does something which is particularly interesting, and it's why I wanted to bring it to you today. So, this is a quote from Laudato Si. "The earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor." And I don't know if you can see or hear in that, but there's this transition, the idea of our obligation to the poor is suddenly laid upon the earth, that the earth is considered our poor, what we have a moral obligation towards. And so some people have actually, really, this is what's really put them off Laudato Si, because they say this is innovation in church teaching, and it's not anthropocentric in the way that the whole Christian narrative is. But I think that there are actually much more interesting, nuanced, and rich ways of understanding what he means in this, that is still anthropocentric, but redefines our understanding of what that means, of what it means to put humans at the centre. The reference to the earth herself and the poor, it can be seen, it almost seems to bestow personhood on creation in a way that, say, for example, I don't know if anyone's ever come across Shintoism, or which is often seen as an animistic religion, or other Native American religions also have this sort of animism in them, where they bestow things in creation with personhood. So you get the idea of a tree having a certain personhood. And this is something that is, if that was the case, if Laudato Si was doing this, there would be huge discussions to be had about whether or not it fits into the moral teaching of the Catholic Church, historical moral teaching. But it doesn't do that. It refers to this fraternity with the earth. So let's have a little look at it a bit closer, Laudato Si. So what it tells us is that the good of the earth is also the good of the human. So just as I spoke earlier about the idea of the sin of the world in John's Gospel, our redemption comes through our relationship with this earth. And whereas we have seen some accounts consider the earth as extrinsic to us, as this thing that, it's almost like a dualism. We have, our humanity, and then there's this thing that we can use as a tool that is a backdrop to our salvation. In Laudato Si, we get that it's something which is also within us. So we are profoundly related to the earth, and this is the idea of fraternity. It's blood relation. So the words Laudato Si mean praise be to you, and they come from the beginning of a canticle by St. Francis, in which he says, praise be to you, my Lord, through our sister, Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, and produces various fruit coloured with the flowers and herbs. And this is one of the first lines in the document. So you hear that again, praise be to you, my Lord, through our sister, Mother Earth. And this is how Francis represents fraternity with creation. So what I think this document is really doing, as I said at the beginning, is calling for a conversion in our hearts in how we relate to our environment and the world around us, creation in that respect. So it's also calling for an awareness, an attentiveness to that relationship with creation. And I think that it's important to say this is still an anthropocentric model of the cosmos. But here, the human is not on a different timeline to creation. Creation is not a backdrop, but rather we are responsible for uniting creation within ourselves to God. So that, I spoke earlier about this people who saw the impossibility of our situation in terms of, we need a redeemer. Well, we certainly need a redeemer, but it is also our responsibility to draw in creation with us to Christ and to So, I mean, like the Eucharist is an obvious example of this, right? That we go to the Eucharist, we bring, there's a line, I think it's maybe in an Orthodox liturgy, of, we bring the gifts that you've given us as gifts to you. So, this idea that you're bringing creation to be offered up to God. This is the true, so according to Laudato Si, it's our true nature and destiny to reconcile all creation with God. An Orthodox theologian called John Zizoulas talks about this, expresses this I think quite well. He says, nature itself stands in need of development through us in order to fulfill its own being and acquire a meaning which it would not otherwise have. This is a development which treats nature as an entity that must not be developed for its own sake, through taking care of its fragility and its groaning in travail. And it's not a new idea. This is an idea that, as I said, Maximus the Confessor, if you want to look at Maximus Confessor after this talk at some point, I would say look at what he writes as well about the idea of microcosm, that we embody a microcosm of the universe in ourselves, and that is part of this relationship of that we are what he calls the priests of creation. So we are lifting up creation to God. So just one more little quote here. We could say that not only is creation ordered towards the good of human beings, but that human beings are ordered towards the good of creation. By their faithful performance of their priesthood, creation attains its final good. So I hope that that's one thing I'm making clear, is that there's a conversion here from that thinking that we looked at in the 1800s, which sees our relationship with creation as being completely, one of using it as a tool, one of utility, to being one where actually we need to realize that we have ecological obligations to creation that we will be held accountable for at some point. And that, I think, is something that I want you to go away with in terms of going back to this, how can this impact my life? Well, conversion, we know from our own spiritual lives, is daily, right? You have daily conversion. You daily try and convert your being towards God. And I think that this is something that is, requires daily attentiveness. Anyone who's ever taught toddlers, I think there's at least 5 people in here who've dealt with young kids, right? And you will be really aware that they don't automatically have an attention span. That they really need to be taught it. And gradually, daily, day by day, they have to be reminded, no, this is the time when you sit down and this is the time when you look. And I've actually noticed this weekend because I realized how wonderfully attentive everyone here has been to each other. It's been quite extraordinary. That you're all sitting very quietly, very patiently, and your attention is on me. I mean, that's mad. But it's taken you years to really, hone that as a habit, and see goodness in it. And I think that that's something that we need to realize, that we are children in the world of understanding our environment and our relationship to creation, and we need to redirect our attention daily and go, how am I thinking about these objects around me that are made out of the materials of the world? Do I know their history? Do I know where they come from? How am I going to be held responsible for the way I treat these things? Even if it's something which seems as inanimate as an iPhone, for example, which we can kind of go, oh, well, that's not nature. But it is nature. It's part of creation. And we have to keep returning our attention to that and going, by having this, I am participating in a certain mode of interacting with creation and a certain relationship. So it's that conversion and that converting your attention that I think is going to be important. So I'll wrap up. Just thinking about this responding. So I think we have to come back to this idea that as Christians we are committed to this anthropocentric understanding of the universe. It's a great and a holy and a glorious thing. But we have to understand how that relates to creation, how we can draw that into our anthropocentrism. And what I've tried to demonstrate here is that the shape it takes in our hearts and our minds cannot be taken for granted. How we perceive this way of looking at the world matters immensely to how we treat our common home. So Laudato Si shows us that to be anthropocentric does not mean devaluing the rest of creation. In fact, it means the opposite. It calls not just for stewardship, but fraternity with our environment and the creatures within it, and a recognition that we are responsible, eternally accountable even, for the redemption of the world. And as my pupil acknowledged, we cannot achieve this by ourselves. We must look for daily conversion. So I return to that phrase of Pope Francis in his most recent encyclical: we are called to be contemplatives, even in the midst of action. We must draw long and deep upon the springs of liturgy and prayer if we are to envision a world of global holiness and unity, and not settle for the mirage of future harmony where these questions haven't yet been asked. I've not aimed to deliver you a path to practical action, or to persuade you to join Extinction Rebellion, or to cut down your consumption of animal products, or to invest in renewable energy, though personally I think that these are all worthwhile activities. But I don't have the authority to tell you that, because I'm not a climate scientist and I'm not a, I don't make environmental policy. But I'd like to present you once more with that phrase. I mean, I've repeated this so many times, you're going to be sick of it. But be contemplative, even in the midst of action. Pope Francis tells us that we're accountable. And so I'm going to leave you with a few areas of contemplation that you might want to... I know we've got the questions as well, and absolutely they're great, so do talk about those. But just a few things that you might want to bring into your discussion, or might just want to bring into your lives generally. So this is just 3 little things that come out of anecdotes. I met a Dominican in the summer, and he gave a sermon where he repeated this phrase that I now keep in my wallet, because it's, I think, a really helpful one to think about daily, is how you spend your money reveals who you are. So that's something maybe to just come back to daily. How you spend your money reveals who you are, and think of that in the context of your relationship with the environment and the world. The first part of the Orthodox liturgy says, let us attend and let us be attentive. So a question you might want to ask yourself is, how attentive am I being to my immediate environment? Do I know the difference between this bird and that bird? Have I noticed diversity? Lastly, St. Francis constantly prays for the reconciliation of all creation, addressing fire, insects, rabbits, fish as brothers and sisters. Do I look for fraternity in the creatures around me? And I would ask to bring that to your prayer. And I think maybe I'll just close, if you don't mind, with a little calling upon some saints to pray for us. Anyone who wants to join in, no obligations. But I'd ask St. Maximus to pray for us. St. Francis.
Pray for us.
St. Benedict.
Pray for us.
St. Melengel.
Pray for us.
St. Bonaventure.
Pray for us.
St. Albert the Great.
Pray for us.
St. Basil the Great.
Pray for us.
And St. John of Damascus.
Pray for us.
Thanks very much.